The January wind came down from the ridgeline like something with teeth, stripping bark from the pines and rattling the tin roof of the cabin Samuel Garrett had built 20 years ago when his hands still knew what purpose felt like. He sat at the pine table he'd planed himself, running his thumb along a groove worn smooth by 2 decades of morning coffee and his wife's habit of tracing circles while she talked. The mug in front of him had gone cold an hour ago. He couldn't remember pouring it. Outside, the world wore the colorless palette of a Montana winter, bone-white snow, charcoal pines, a sky the shade of old pewter. Samuel was 58 but felt ancient, hollowed out like the deadfall trees that littered his 40 acres. The photographs on the mantel stood face down, because looking at Ellen's smile or Michael's graduation portrait required a kind of strength he no longer possessed. 3 years since cancer took his wife. 6 months since a falling pine crushed his son during a logging job that was supposed to be simple. The medical bills had consumed the cattle ranch, 200 head sold at auction, the land subdivided and parceled off to strangers who'd never felt the weight of a newborn calf or known the particular silence of pre-dawn feeding rounds. What remained was this: the original homestead 8 miles from the nearest neighbor, and the creeping certainty that he'd lived past the point where living mattered. Samuel split firewood because his body remembered the rhythm even when his mind wandered. Ate beans from the can because cooking for one felt like an accusation. Spoke to no one because speech required belief that words could still shape reality, and he'd lost that faith somewhere between the hospice room and the funeral and the terrible afternoon when the sheriff knocked on his door with the kind of news that arrives only once in a lifetime if you're lucky. 11 days since he'd heard his own voice aloud. The axe fell. Split pine tumbled into the snow. He reached for another log. Then the sound came, a whinny, low and desperate, slicing through the wind's monotone howl. Samuel froze mid-reach. Horses didn't live out here anymore. The nearest ranch was miles away, and winter turned these mountains into a maze of frozen creeks and wind-scoured ridges that swallowed the unprepared. Another sound followed, the unmistakable, tremulous cry of a newborn foal. Samuel's breath caught. He set down the axe with deliberate care, the way a man moves when he's not certain whether he's hearing ghosts or God. His boots crunched through crusted snow as he walked toward the tree line, following the sound through the pines where morning light came filtered and fractured. He saw her between 2 lodgepole pines, a chestnut mare so emaciated that her ribs cast their own shadows, each breath visible as steam in the frozen air. She stood trembling, not from fear but from the final dregs of determination, the way runners look when they cross a finish line and collapse. Beside her in the snow lay a foal no more than hours old, still damp, legs folded beneath her like a fawn's, trying and failing to stand on limbs that shook with effort and cold. The mare's eyes found Samuel's and he recognized the expression. He'd seen it in the hospital mirror during Ellen's final weeks. The look of someone who's fought past the point of winning, who persists only because surrender means watching someone else suffer. She wasn't asking. She was begging. Samuel moved slowly, the way he'd approach any frightened animal, though this one showed no signs of flight. The foal's coat was dull brown, her muzzle pale, her breathing shallow and quick. He knelt in the snow, and the cold bit through his jeans immediately, but he barely noticed. Up close, the mare's condition was worse than he'd thought. Hollowed flanks, cracked hooves, a coat that had lost its sheen to weeks, maybe months, of starvation. Then he saw it, 3 thin leather cords braided into the mare's tail, and tucked within them, a small piece of paper folded tight against the weather. The leather was worn smooth, the kind of careful work someone does when they know it has to last. His fingers were too numb to unfold it, too stiff to manage the delicate work, but he could see the edge of handwriting, pencil, shaky, desperate. The foal made a sound, small and pitiful, and Samuel's chest constricted. He'd sworn after burying his son that he was done saving things, done believing that effort mattered when the world took what it wanted regardless. But the foal was dying in front of him, and the mare was watching with those terrible, knowing eyes, and his hands were already moving before his mind caught up. He lifted the foal, impossibly light, like lifting mist-given form, and tucked her against his chest. Her body shuddered with cold. The mare followed without hesitation as Samuel walked toward the barn, that structure he'd avoided for 6 months because it smelled like the life he'd lost. Snow crunched beneath his boots. The foal's heartbeat flickered against his ribs like a moth trapped behind glass. Inside the barn, dust motes drifted through slanted morning light, and Samuel laid the foal on straw that whispered like memory. The mare stood in the doorway, steam rising from her withers, still watching. He pulled the note from her tail with careful fingers and held it up to the light. The handwriting was barely legible, pressed hard into cheap paper. Her name is Cora. Baby is Hope. We can't feed them. Please, if you find them, Call Sarah Mackenzie. Tell her I tried. Below the words, smudged but readable, was a phone number and 2 initials, JM. Samuel stood in the barn holding a stranger's surrender, and for the first time in 11 days he spoke aloud. His voice came out rusted and raw, shaped around a question that was also a prayer. How far did you come to find me? Cora answered with a low nicker that sounded like forgiveness, and Samuel realized he was crying. Samuel carried the foal through the barn's central corridor, past empty stalls that still bore the nameplates of horses sold at auction. Dancer, Redemption, Morning Glory, each one a small grave marker for the life he'd dismantled. He laid Hope on a bed of fresh straw in the corner stall, the one with southern exposure where winter sunlight pooled like honey on the wooden floor. The foal's breathing came quick and shallow, her coat matted with birth fluid that had begun to freeze. Samuel worked with the efficient tenderness of muscle memory, warming water on the wood stove he kept in the tack room, finding horse blankets in a trunk that smelled of cedar and vanished years. He wiped Hope down with careful strokes, stimulating circulation the way he'd done for dozens of newborns back when birth still felt like blessing rather than burden. The foal's eyes tracked his movements with that universal bewilderment of the newly alive, as if asking why the world required so much cold and effort. Samuel wrapped her in layers of wool, tucking the edges tight, then turned his attention to Cora. The mare had followed him inside and now stood in the stall doorway with the patience of someone who'd waited so long that a few more minutes made no difference. Samuel approached with a bucket of warm water mixed with molasses, the sweet smell cutting through the barn's mustiness. Cora drank deeply, desperately, her throat working in long pulls that spoke of miles traveled without relief. He ran his hands along her flanks, feeling the architecture of starvation. Each rib distinct, hip bones jutting like accusations, muscle wasted to sinew. Whoever had sent her had loved her once. The leather cords braided into her tail were the work of steady hands, someone who knew horses and wanted this final message to survive weather and wilderness. Samuel retrieved the note from his coat pocket and unfolded it fully in the tack room's lamplight. The paper was torn from a spiral notebook, its edges rough. The handwriting tilted right, formed by someone whose hands no longer obeyed completely. Words crossed out and rewritten. A smudge that might have been water or tears. Her name is Cora. Baby is Hope. We can't feed them. The ranch is gone. Bank took everything. I'm sick. My daughter is alone. Please, if you find them, call Sarah Mackenzie, Teller County. Tell her they're safe. Tell her I tried. JM. The phone number below was written 3 times, as if the writer feared the pencil wouldn't hold or the paper might tear or memory itself might fail before the message reached its destination. Samuel read it twice, then a 3rd time, and something he'd thought permanently extinguished flickered in his chest. Not hope, he didn't trust that word anymore, but something adjacent to it. Recognition maybe. The understanding that someone else had fought past reason, past possibility, and sent what they loved most into the wilderness with nothing but prayer braided into horsehair. He looked at Cora, who was watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes, and spoke aloud for the 2nd time in 11 days. You picked me on purpose, didn't you? The mare's ears swiveled toward his voice. Samuel walked back to the cabin through snow that had begun falling again, fat flakes drifting down through the pines like ash from some distant fire. Inside, the rotary phone on the kitchen wall, an artifact Ellen had refused to replace because she liked the weight of the receiver, the satisfying click of the dial, seemed to mock him with its obsolete functionality. He hadn't used it in weeks. Most days he forgot it existed. His finger found the dial holes, rotated through the numbers. The phone rang once, twice, 7 times. Samuel was about to hang up when a woman's voice answered, thin and exhausted, scraped raw by what sounded like weeks of crying. Hello? Is this Sarah Mackenzie? Silence stretched across the line, vast and trembling. Then, barely audible, did you find them? The question carried such desperate hope that Samuel's throat tightened. I found a chestnut mare and a foal. The mare has a note braided into her tail. A sound came through the phone, something between a sob and a prayer. Are they alive? Please tell me they're alive. They're alive. Starving but alive. I've got them in my barn. Oh God. Oh thank God. Sarah's voice fractured. I've been searching, where are you? I can come get them. I can be there tomorrow. I don't have much but I'll figure something out, I just need them safe, Miss Mackenzie. Samuel's voice was gentle, the tone he'd used with frightened animals and his son during nightmares. Take a breath. Tell me what happened. So she did. The words tumbled out in fragments. Her father James Mackenzie, 71, 4th-generation rancher in eastern Montana. Drought that killed the grazing land. Bank foreclosure in October. Her mother dead 5 years. James deteriorating, pride and dementia tangling until he couldn't tell past from present. 2 weeks ago he'd braided that note into Cora's tail, told Sarah he was sending them to find someone kind, then released the mare into the wilderness. The foal had been born somewhere during Cora's journey, miles from anywhere, and somehow they'd survived. He disappeared the same night, Sarah said. I've been looking everywhere. The police say there's nothing they can do until... She stopped. Is my father with you? No. Just the horses. Silence again, but this one felt like falling. I'll come get them, Sarah said finally. I'm staying in my truck mostly, sometimes a motel. I can be there by... Where's home? Samuel interrupted. I don't have one anymore. The bank. Then come here. Stay as long as you need. We'll find your father together. The words surprised him even as he spoke them. He'd spent 6 months learning how to be alone, perfecting the art of emptiness, and now he was inviting a stranger into the life he'd carefully reduced to silence and routine. I don't understand, Sarah whispered. You don't even know me. Samuel looked out the window toward the barn where Cora stood watch over her daughter, both of them rescued by the thinnest thread of chance and compassion. Your father trusted his horses to find someone who'd help. Seems wrong to prove him wrong now. Sarah's breath caught. I'll leave in an hour. Drive safe. The roads up here don't forgive mistakes. He hung up and stood in the kitchen's dimness, his reflection ghostly in the window glass. The last time he'd offered shelter to anyone, it had been Michael coming home from college for Christmas break, 3 months before the accident. Samuel had sworn after the funeral that he was done opening doors, done believing that connection could survive the world's casual cruelty. But Cora had walked 8 miles through frozen wilderness to prove that sometimes the lost find exactly who they need, and Samuel realized he'd just made a promise he had no idea how to keep. Sarah Mackenzie arrived the following afternoon in a Ford pickup held together by rust and determination, its exhaust pipe trailing blue smoke like a distress signal. Samuel watched from the cabin porch as she climbed out, a woman in her mid-30s with her father's angular features and eyes that had seen too much lost too quickly. She wore a canvas jacket 2 sizes too large and boots caked with mud from 100 roadside searches. When she saw the barn, something in her posture broke and she ran. Samuel followed at a distance, giving her the privacy grief demanded. Through the barn door he watched Sarah drop to her knees beside Cora, wrapping both arms around the mare's neck and pressing her face into the coarse mane. The sounds she made were raw and wordless, the kind of crying that comes from a place beyond language. Cora stood perfectly still, as if she understood her job wasn't finished, that bearing witness was its own form of labor. After a long while, Sarah pulled back and noticed Hope, now standing on wobbling legs, nursing with the focused intensity of the newly alive. Sarah's hands went to her mouth. She was pregnant. I didn't even know she was pregnant. Born somewhere between your father's place and here, Samuel said from the doorway. Can't have been more than a few hours old when they arrived. That's impossible. Sarah stopped, recalculating the cruelty required for a starving mare to give birth in wilderness and then keep walking. How far did they come? Near as I can figure, at least 8 miles through backcountry. Maybe more if she wandered. Samuel moved into the stall, running a hand along Cora's shoulder. She knew where she was going though. Came straight here like someone drew her a map. Sarah stood slowly, wiping her eyes with the heel of her hand. My father used to say horses could find water in a drought and kindness in a crowd. I thought it was just something old ranchers said. She looked at Samuel with an expression caught between gratitude and devastation. You saved them. They saved themselves. I just opened the door. For 3 days they searched for James Mackenzie. They drove logging roads that barely qualified as roads, checked abandoned hunting cabins where snow had drifted through broken windows, stopped at gas stations and diners to show a photograph of a man with white hair and sun-carved features. No one had seen him. Sarah showed Samuel other photos too. James as a younger man standing beside championship quarter horses. James teaching her to ride when she was 6. James at her mother's grave with shoulders bent under invisible weight. The last year was hardest, Sarah said one evening in Samuel's cabin, cradling coffee that had gone cold while she talked. He'd forget where he was. Call me by my mother's name. But he never forgot the horses. Cora especially. She was the last one left after we sold the others. Her voice dropped to something barely audible. He must have thought if he sent her away, she'd survive what he couldn't. Samuel recognized the particular grammar of that sentence. The past tense that meant hoping had been replaced by mourning. On the fourth day they drove to Teller County to file a missing persons report at the sheriff's office, a squat brick building that smelled of burnt coffee and bureaucratic resignation. The deputy who took Sarah's information was a woman in her 40s named Rita Cortez, with steel gray hair pulled back and the alert eyes of someone who'd stopped believing official explanations years ago. "Mackenzie," Rita said, her expression shifting from professional sympathy to something sharper. "Mackenzie Ranch, Eastern Montana." "Yes," Sarah said. "You know it?" Rita leaned back in her chair, choosing her words with visible care. "I know the bank that foreclosed. Northern Plains Financial. They've taken 17 ranches in this county in the past 2 years." She paused. "All small operations. All sold to development companies within weeks of foreclosure." Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach. "That's legal?" "Legal as a heart attack and just as cruel." Rita pulled up files on her computer, her jaw tight. "They offer emergency loans to struggling ranchers during droughts. High-interest short terms. Then foreclose the moment someone misses a payment. No restructuring, no extensions. They appraise low, sell high, pocket the difference." Sarah's hands had gone white around the edge of the desk. "How much did they sell our ranch for?" Rita's fingers moved across the keyboard. When she found the number, her expression darkened. "Your father owed $340,000. The ranch was appraised at $800,000. Northern Plains sold it to Mountain Vista Development for $2.1 million 6 weeks after foreclosure." The math was brutal in its simplicity. Sarah made a sound like she'd been struck. "Could they have restructured his loan?" Samuel asked. "Could have. Chose not to." Rita closed the file with deliberate precision. "I've been documenting their pattern for 2 years. Waiting for enough evidence to make someone care." She looked at Sarah with an expression that carried the weight of every case she'd filed and forgotten. "I'm sorry about your father." "He's not dead," Sarah said, but the words came out hollow. "Actually," Rita said slowly, "he might not be." She pulled up another file. "We found a man 3 days ago near the old Mackenzie property line. Hypothermia, malnutrition, severe disorientation. No ID. He's at County Medical. Kept saying he had to check on the horses." Sarah was already standing, her chair scraping backward. Samuel caught her elbow as she swayed. They ran through hospital corridors that smelled of antiseptic and defeated hope, past nurses who called after them about visiting hours. James Mackenzie lay in a bed by a window overlooking the parking lot, and 4 threading into his arm, his face gaunt and age-spotted beneath fluorescent lighting. When Sarah burst through the door, his eyes, clouded but present, found her face. "Sarah?" His voice was dust and confusion. "I'm here, Dad." She took his hand, and Samuel watched recognition bloom slowly across the old man's features. James's gaze drifted past his daughter to Samuel standing in the doorway. 2 ranchers hollowed out by different losses, recognizing each other across sterile light and antiseptic air. "Did Cora find someone?" James whispered. "She found the best person she could," Sarah said, her voice breaking. James closed his eyes and tears traced paths down his weathered cheeks. "I knew she would. I knew kindness leaves a trail." He opened his eyes again, looking directly at Samuel. "Thank you for not turning them away." Samuel nodded, unable to speak past the constriction in his throat. That evening Sarah received a phone call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was smooth as oil, professionally sympathetic in the way that meant cruelty wearing a suit. Marcus Dalton, attorney for Northern Plains Financial, had heard James Mackenzie had been located and wanted to clarify some outstanding matters regarding asset recovery. Specifically, the horses. According to the foreclosure settlement, Dalton explained, any remaining livestock constitutes bank property. We'll be sending someone to collect the mare and foal at your earliest convenience. Sarah's hand tightened around the phone until her knuckles went bone white. Samuel watched her face transform from grief to something incandescent and furious. "They're not assets," she said, her voice shaking. "They're living beings. Miss Mackenzie, I understand this is emotional, but legally..." Samuel took the phone from her hand. "They're on my property now. You want them, you bring a warrant." He hung up before Dalton could respond, and in the silence that followed, Sarah looked at him with an expression that asked a question neither of them knew how to answer. How do you fight an institution designed to take everything while calling it justice? Marcus Dalton did bring a warrant, or attempted to, arriving at Samuel's property 3 days later in a black sedan that looked obscene against the snow and pines. He emerged wearing a charcoal suit and the expression of someone accustomed to winning through attrition rather than merit. Samuel met him at the property line with arms crossed and the particular stillness that comes from having nothing left to lose. "Mr. Garrett, I'm here on behalf of Northern Plains Financial to collect livestock specified in the Mackenzie foreclosure settlement." Dalton extended papers that crackled in the cold air. "This is a court order for asset recovery." Samuel didn't take them. "Those horses weren't on the property when you foreclosed. They're not your assets. Mr. Mackenzie released them illegally, attempting to hide assets from creditors. That makes them subject to recovery regardless of current location." Dalton's smile was the kind designed to make reasonable people feel unreasonable. "I'm trying to make this easy for everyone involved." "Nothing about this is easy," Sarah said, emerging from the cabin with James leaning heavily on her arm. The old man had been released from the hospital that morning against medical advice, insisting he needed to see Cora one more time. "My father didn't hide assets. He saved his horses from starving." Dalton's expression flickered with something that might have been pity if it weren't so rehearsed. "Miss Mackenzie, I understand you're upset, but the law is clear. If you don't comply, we'll involve local authorities." "Then involve them," Samuel said quietly. "But those horses don't leave my property." What Samuel didn't know was that Rita Cortez had been making calls of her own. While Dalton was serving papers in the wilderness, Rita was contacting the Rural Justice Collective, a non-profit organization specializing in predatory lending cases across Montana. By the time Dalton returned to his office, a lawyer named Elena Rosario had already filed a counter-motion citing Montana's livestock sanctuary statutes and challenging the warrant's legal foundation. The case went before Judge Helen Ortiz 2 weeks later in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and newer desperation. Samuel sat beside Sarah and James, the old man thinner but clear-headed, dressed in the only suit he'd worn to anything other than funerals. On the opposite side, Marcus Dalton flanked by 2 Northern Plains executives in suits that cost more than most ranchers made in a season. Elena Rosario was younger than Samuel expected, maybe 40, with dark hair streaked silver and the controlled intensity of someone who'd chosen her battles carefully and refused to lose them. She stood before Judge Ortiz, a woman in her 60s who'd grown up on a ranch herself and whose eyes suggested she'd seen every variety of human cruelty dressed as commerce, and laid out the case with surgical precision. "Your Honor, the horses in question were not listed in the foreclosure inventory. Mr. Mackenzie released them before Northern Plains took possession, making them unclaimed animals under state law. When they arrived at Mr. Garrett's property in distress, he exercised his right under Montana statute to provide emergency care. Northern Plains Financial has no legal claim to animals they never possessed and Mr. Garrett voluntarily rescued." Dalton stood, his voice smooth with practiced authority. "Your Honor, Mr. Mackenzie's mental state was severely compromised. His actions constitute asset concealment, and the bank has every right to recover property that should have been part of the settlement." "Property." Elena's voice cut through the courtroom like wire through snow. "Northern Plains Financial has foreclosed on 17 family ranches in this county in 2 years. They offer predatory loans during droughts, refuse restructuring, then sell the land for 2 to 3 times what families owed. The Mackenzie Ranch was appraised at $800,000. They sold it for $2.1 million 6 weeks after foreclosure." She placed documents on the bench with controlled force. "This isn't about a horse, Your Honor. This is about whether compassion can exist in a system designed to extract everything, land, livelihood, dignity, from people who've worked it their entire lives." The courtroom held its breath. Judge Ortiz read the documents slowly, her expression unreadable. When she finally looked up, her gaze settled on James Mackenzie. "Mr. Mackenzie, can you explain why you released your horses?" James stood with Sarah's help, his voice thin but steady. "I couldn't feed them anymore, Your Honor. The drought killed the grazing. The bank took my land before I could recover. I was sick, confused, but I knew one thing: Cora deserved better than starving while lawyers argued about who owned her suffering." His hands trembled on the railing. "I braided a note into her tail and prayed she'd find someone kind. She did. That's all I wanted. That's all I've ever wanted." Judge Ortiz was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every small ranch that had vanished from Montana's landscape, replaced by vacation properties and development signs. "Mr. Dalton, I've read your files. I've seen what Northern Plains Financial has done in this county. The law may be on your side, but mercy is not." She looked at James with an expression that belonged to someone remembering her own family's struggles. "Mr. Mackenzie, those horses are yours. They were always yours. This court finds that Northern Plains Financial has no legal claim to animals released before foreclosure and subsequently rescued under Montana's emergency care provisions. Case dismissed. The gavel's crack echoed like thunder in the small room. Outside, snow had begun falling again, soft and purposeful. James moved into Samuel's cabin temporarily, just until he regained his strength, but weeks became months and neither man mentioned leaving. They repaired fence lines together, rebuilt stalls with wood that still smelled of sap and future. Sarah visited every weekend, bringing veterinary supplies and the kind of laughter that comes from surviving what should have killed you. By spring, Hope was galloping through meadows that had greened with snowmelt, her legs no longer stick-thin but strong and sure. Cora grazed in sunlight that turned her coat copper-bright, and sometimes she'd lift her head and watch the two old men working fence posts with the patience of someone who'd traveled 8 miles through wilderness and knew exactly what she'd been searching for. One evening Samuel and James stood at the fence line watching the horses. The photographs on Samuel's mantle had been turned face up again. Sarah's veterinary practice had opened in Teller County, specializing in ranch animals that needed someone who understood what caring cost. "I thought I was finished," James said quietly. "So did I," Samuel replied. "What changed?" Samuel thought about the note braided into Cora's tail, about Sarah's voice breaking across a phone line, about the strange persistence of life even when everything argues for surrender. Someone needed me to not be finished yet. The sun dropped behind the ridgeline, painting the snow gold and rose. Cora and Hope stood together in the gathering dusk, their silhouettes dark against the light, and Samuel understood finally what Ellen used to say about how broken things don't always need fixing. Sometimes they just need space to heal alongside other broken things until the cracks become part of the pattern, stronger for having been fractured and remade. He never knew how Cora found him across 8 miles of frozen wilderness, but maybe kindness leaves a trail the lost can always follow, and maybe that's enough. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts below.